I'd like to welcome you to the first issue of Reason Wizardry. I'm Jeremy Jansen. As you probably already know, the goal of these videos is to delve deep into the advanced sound design possibilities in Reason 4. Each month we'll cover different synthesis techniques that will enable you to create your own cutting-edge sounds. Keep in mind that Reason Wizardry assumes you already know the basics. That way, we can skip right to the good stuff and get started. If you don't understand a basic concept here, be sure you've read the Reason manual. And if it still doesn't make sense, feel free to post on our forum and I'll be sure to try and help. This first issue, we're going to concentrate on the Thor polysonic synthesizer. I'm going to start with routing in Thor. When we look at Thor, it's easy to visualize the signal path. It seems pretty standard. The signal originates at the oscillators, travels through the filters, through the shaper, through the amplifier, through the third filter, and then through the master effects. But it's important to remember that Thor is a semi-modular synthesizer. You can actually patch the signal pretty much anywhere you want it using the mod matrix, instead of using the pre-made routing schemes. For example, let's create a basic patch that breaks some of the rules of the traditional routing. Let's add oscillator 1 as an analog saw, heading into an LP filter. Now we'll route it into filter 2, also another LP filter, and then we'll send that out to the amp. But now we're going to use the mod matrix to send a feedback signal from filter 2 back to filter 1. Feedback is pretty unstable to work with. It's really sensitive to your drive and resonance. I'm going to play with those parameters a bit and a little bit of frequency, and you can hear some of the different sounds you can make with feedback. You can get volume spikes pretty easily with this, so make sure to use a limiter. We could also modulate the feedback amount with an envelope. It's almost a little bit of a vowel-like timbre there. So if you desire a really controllable sound with feedback, you'll probably have some issues. You'll have to play around with modulating certain parameters by keyboard range, or sampling the exact sound you want and importing it back into one of Reason's sampler devices. Alright, I'm going to show you one more patch using feedback in an even more advanced way and some different routing. So let's have a look. What we have here is a single oscillator that's ring modulated by a second oscillator going into filter 2. Now, if we look at the mod matrix, we're routing filter 2 directly into filter 1 instead of outputting it to the amp. So we're going from filter 2 to filter 1 and then into the shaper. Now the shaper is directly routed back into filter 2. So you have a non-standard feedback path there from filter 2 to filter 1 to shaper back to filter 2. Let's hear how it sounds. That's not with any shaping. With feedback, when you have a shaper in the signal path, often you can create some really wild tones. You have to be quite careful with it, but let's give it a shot. And if we send a little bit more feedback here, let's give that a try. Whoa. Let's try a different shaper. Once again, you can additionally modulate this with an envelope or LFO. Let's give an LFO a shot. So hopefully now you've seen that you can really go beyond what Thor initially shows you as far as the signal path, and that's the way to create truly advanced patches. Alright, now we're going to look at skipping modules. Here we have a single square oscillator going into an LP filter. The LP filter has envelope modulation. You can hear how it sounds. So it's maybe the start of a heavily filtered bass, something like that. So now what if we wanted to add another oscillator, let's say a saw wave, but we don't really want that filtered sound for this saw wave. We can do that. We can skip the filter using the mod matrix. Watch how. We'll use oscillator 2 as the source, and the destination depends where we want its signal to go. We can send it directly to filter 3, and it doesn't matter if there's no filter in there. Let's try that first. Since filter 3 is a stereo filter, we'll want to send oscillator 2 to both the left and right side of the filter. Okay, that's sounding a lot brighter. One thing you have to keep in mind is if you send an oscillator directly to a filter, it isn't going to be modified by the amp envelope. So we have to scale it in the mod matrix by the amp envelope, or else it'll completely ignore it. See, that doesn't sound right at all. Much better. So now we have our buzzy saw wave bypassing the filter, and we still have our square wave going through the filter. If we turn down, the saw is kind of bright. If we turn it down, we can hear both of them. We can't use the mixer to turn it down because we're bypassing the mixer, all of this, and going straight to filter 3. So we'll have to modify the amount in the mod matrix. Add a little bit of detune. Alright, I'll give you one more quick example of this bypass bit, how it's incredibly useful on some presets. So in this case we have a single wavetable oscillator going through a Foreman filter. So it's quite vocal-like. So we want to add another oscillator, but it doesn't go through the Foreman filter. Well, we've done that in the mod matrix here. Oscillator 2 is a detuned saw wave, and we can just turn up the amounts in order to hear it. And keep in mind this doesn't take up filter 2, because there's always the alternative of not using the mod matrix at all and running oscillator 2 directly through an empty filter 2. That can accomplish the same thing, but in this case, using the mod matrix, you'll be able to add another filter to doing something else. So by bypassing modules, you can make maximum use of all the filters. You can fill all 3 filters with different sounds and just have them affect a single oscillator. So using this, you have maximum control over the sounds you're building. Not only can you freely route audio to different paths in Thor using the mod matrix, you can also route audio to different modulation paths. This is called audio rate modulation, and it's usually found only in high-end analog synths. There are 3 major types of audio rate modulation in Thor. First is frequency modulation, or FM. Second is amplitude modulation, also known as ring modulation, or AM. And finally, there's filter frequency modulation, or filter FM. To visualize and better understand what's happening with audio rate modulation, imagine that we're using an extremely fast LFO to modulate these parameters. Once the LFO passes 20 Hz, it's considered in audio range. So if we play an A1 note and use that to modulate something, we're actually modulating that parameter at 440 Hz. That's pretty fast. It's so fast that it can change the timbre of the sound completely. I'm going to go through each one of the audio rate modulations in turn. Frequency modulation is what you're used to hearing in a Yamaha DX7 or similar digital synth. It produces glassy, bright, and sometimes very aggressive timbres. You probably already have experience with FM in Thor by using the FM pair module. This technique produces a similar sound but can be considerably more flexible than the FM pairs. First, we'll add 2 FM pair oscillators. Now we'll go into the mod matrix and modulate oscillator 1 using oscillator 2. We'll turn down their internal FM to 0. So that's just a sine wave. The great thing about FM this way is you can use different oscillators other than the sine used in the FM pair. You can modulate wavetable oscillators, noise, or anything else. And you're probably wondering why I'm using the bottom two rows of the mod matrix for this. Well, that's because it's got two scale parameters, and you'll want to scale the FM amount usually by envelopes, velocity, key scaling, LFOs. Let's give that a quick shot here. We'll alter the tuning of the FM pair. We'll give that a little bit of coarse to warm it up. So that's a pretty classic FM sound, and it's very flexible when used this way. I'd recommend using the mod matrix for your FM almost exclusively. Alright, I'm going to show you another simple patch with FM. This time we're using one FM pair oscillator for a carrier and one wavetable oscillator for a modulator. You can see how it looks in the mod matrix. It's very simple. There's your sine oscillator. Now let's modulate it with the modulator. As I said before, it's very flexible this way because with a wavetable oscillator, you have many different choices of wavetables and waveforms. So that's the fixed sines. But besides that, what's very unique about this is we can modulate the position of the wavetable at the same time as doing FM. That's what I've set up here, and it sounds quite incredible. We're going to modulate it with a mod envelope. So the mod envelope's going to raise the position and then bring it back down. So that's the same thing as doing this. So we can try that with any of the wavetables for a variety of different sounds. Let's try the formant wavetable, one of my favorites. And while doing that, of course, we can modulate the amount of FM with something else. What about the filter envelope? Or maybe an LFO, actually. Trombone doesn't work so well. The wavetables that work best for this generally are the different signs. So this is only half of the equation, of course, because we can get even more complexity by changing the carrier to a wavetable oscillator as well. So this is a different kind of FM than what was possible on the DX7. We don't have 6 operators, we don't have 6 envelopes, we don't have all those different tools, but what we have is very different and capable of some really cool stuff on its own. And we haven't done anything with the filters yet. So to just leave you with anything, remember that wavetable oscillators with FM is something worth exploring. Next is AM modulation, or ring modulation. AM modulation is produced by modulating the volume of an oscillator with the audio signal from a different oscillator. In this case, we'll modulate oscillator 1 with oscillator 2. We can set it up in the mod matrix by using oscillator 2, going to the amplifier gain. The problem is it doesn't sound very good in Thor. I'm not exactly sure why. In theory, it should be okay. But listen to the difference by using the fixed function AM path. Okay, now the fixed function. Sounds almost like a square wave was created. Now back to the mod matrix. Ugh, nasty. Since that didn't work so well, I'll show you a not so obvious audio rate modulation that does work well. I call it position modulation. Let's switch to a wavetable oscillator. Now we'll use a second oscillator to modulate the position amount. Let's get an analog sine. Oscillator 2, going to oscillator 1 position. The sound that you can get using this technique is heavily dependent on what wavetable you use, as well as the modulation amount. So let's just go through a few more different tables. Of course, the tuning of the modulation oscillator also makes a difference. As well as its waveform. So if you play around with this, you can find some pretty neat sounds that aren't exactly like FM, aren't exactly like wavetable, something a little bit different. If you push it a little bit too far, you can hear it's somewhat messy. But in a small range, it's a pretty useful audio rate modulation that you probably didn't already think of. Finally, let's try out Filter FM. In my opinion, Filter FM is the audio rate modulation that Thor is best suited for and sounds best. Filter FM works with all filter types except Formant. Even Comb works. For the most classic Filter FM sounds, start with a 24 dB LP filter. Of course, the oscillator we use as a modulation matters a lot too. Oscillators with less high frequency content tend to sound smoother with Filter FM. So we'll start with a sine oscillator. You can see we've already got set up oscillator 2 going to Filter 1 FM. First, let's hear it without the Filter FM. A very heavily filtered saw wave. Now, if we change the tuning of oscillator 2, listen to what happens. It changes very significantly the sound of the filter. Filter FM is great when modulated with an envelope. Almost a Formant filter there, just out of nowhere, using Filter FM and a regular LP filter. Let's try an LFO. Okay, that sounds a little bit like Fido. So with filter FM, using a filter becomes a little bit more complex. You have more parameters other than cutoff and resonance that can make a difference. The big ones are the tuning of the modulation oscillator, the modulation amount, the envelope amount for the filter itself, the envelope amount for the modulation, the cutoff, and the resonance. So, wow, that's a whole lot more than 2 parameters. So you can see this is a great place to put combinator knobs and Thor knobs to use so that you have all those parameters at your fingertips and you can make the most of filter FM in Thor. Now we're going to dive even deeper. We've looked at oscillators to modulate a variety of audio rate destinations. But did you know you can use the output of filters to modulate all the same destinations? So imagine filter to filter FM, or filter to oscillator FM, or filter to oscillator position mod. All are possible using the mod matrix. Let's have a look. Now, if you thought the previous filter FM was complex, now using another filter, the amount of parameters are just crazy. Let's take oscillator 2 running into a formant filter and not being output to the amp. Now we set up the filter modulation. Filter 2 goes to filter 1 FM. First we'll hear it without. So now, in addition to all the parameters I talked about last time that make a difference to filter FM, the tuning, the cutoff, the envelope positions, you also have filter 2 which changes things. So let's just play with the tuning a bit and then filter 2. Now, forgetting about filter FM for a second, we can route that same filter into oscillator 1. Let's just quickly change one bit of the mod matrix. Filter 2 to oscillator 1 FM. Okay, now we can also do the same thing for a wavetable position. Just changing one line of the mod matrix here. We'll go to oscillator 1 position with the random signs. Or we can switch it to a comb again. Now we're going to have a look at a patch that uses a lot of the different philosophies we've been talking about this month in Reason Wizardry. Of course, you can explore it later at your leisure as it's included with your subscription. So first, let's hear how it sounds. It's a sequenced patch, so we can just click the Run button here. So let's try and figure out the signal path. We've got oscillator 1 going into a formant filter. Now we can see here that this filter is then routed into a bandpass filter. It's routed into the left and right side at different levels. So that gives a stereo signal. Oscillator 2 bypasses the filter and heads straight into filter 3. Different levels for left and right. That way you can balance just like with a mixer. Oscillator 3 is doing filter FM on the third filter. And filter 1 is FM modulating oscillator 2 based on an LFO. Wow. So there's a lot going on there. Let's play with the filter FM amount a bit. No filter FM at all. That's pretty thin and reedy, isn't it? Change the tuning of the filter FM modulation oscillator. And then the amount of oscillator 2 FM being fed from the formant filter. And a little bit more of that oscillator 2 in the final mix. So when you look at a patch this way, there's so many more options for sound design. We're not just running an oscillator through a filter and throwing some coarse and delay at the end. It's really more of a modular form of synthesis, and we're very lucky to have Thor to do this with, instead of cables and expensive modules and all the rest that comes with doing it in a physical world. We might not be able to get everything or the exact sound that those guys that spend tons of money on that do, but you can get pretty close with Thor, and you can save your patches without drawing where each cable goes. Anyway, I really hope you've enjoyed this first issue of Reason Wizardry. We've talked a fair bit about the feedback and routing in Thor, and things are really starting to look complex? Probably. Once again, I encourage you to post on our forum or email me if you have questions. Next month, we're going to be exploring more of Thor, and I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you are too. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for giving us a look. Cheers.